All right, so welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get things kicked off here. So again, welcome everyone to today's webinar where we will be discussing building dynamic questionnaires with rule chains. And I do want to make note right up front that this is an advanced topic as we will be covering quite a few different decisions features today. However, if you are a beginner on the line, that's totally okay. We encourage you to watch this as it might get the wheels turning in your head about how you might go about implementing some of these features in the future. Now, speaking of those of you who might be new to decisions, just to go over what we are and what we are a business process management software that helps non-technical people like myself to easily automate and optimize business processes without the need to code. And you'll see that throughout today's webinar, we will not be using any coding. And on this slide, we have some of our current customers in different sectors to give you an idea of where decisions fit. We are equal parts rule engine and workflow, so there's a lot of different problems that we can solve across different industries. Now, speaking of current customers, let's talk about a few use cases with customers that we have that are currently using dynamic questionnaires. So we do have a mortgage company who uses dynamic questionnaires during the forbearance application process to determine the appropriate data points that need to be captured for their specific situation. And by using rules to examine how a set of questions were answered, the decisions rule and flow engine can then serve up the next set of questions required to be asked based on those previous answers. Along with this process, there are rules in place that are also going to dynamically determine which documents are going to be required to submit with that application. Now, another customer in the healthcare industry is using dynamic questionnaires to provide a very guided experience during the medical appointment scheduling process to gather specific details required based on the appointment type that's being made and or some of the symptoms that they're experiencing. So no need to have patients fill out questions about symptoms if they're simply trying to schedule an appointment to have a shot or a vaccine. Now, another customer of ours in the healthcare space is using dynamic questionnaires to walk customers through a series of different sets of questions to make recommendations on enrollment into certain lifestyle programs for things like weight loss or maybe just overall wellness programs. Now, in this specific use case that I mentioned, our customer is actually using their own custom front end and having decisions be the back end logic that's driving the types of questions that need to be asked. Now, one thing I want everyone to keep in mind is not all of these customers might be using the rule chain approach, as we do have many other features and capabilities to help you tackle those dynamic questionnaires. But our focus today will be on rule chains. But again, I do just want to make it very clear that rule chains are not the only way to have that dynamic questionnaire functionality. So if what you see today doesn't quite match the needs of your use case, we'd be happy to have a discussion with you for some other design approaches you might want to take. Now, you guys have been hearing me speak for a couple minutes now, so I'd love to introduce my colleague, Tyler, so I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you very much. So as you can see our lovely headshots, and I will admit Jessica's the better looking one of us. So you can match a name with our face, and you can see our LinkedIn profile. So you can feel free to happy to reach out on LinkedIn if you have any questions or anything. So we've met quite a few on webinars, other video calls, or even demos in the past. But we'd like to discuss to you some upcoming events we're having come up here at Decisions here quickly. They can join virtually as we're still in a virtual world. So let me go ahead and move forward to our events that are coming up. So our first event coming up is actually our Lunch and Learns. Our Lunch and Learns used to happen once a week. And now they happen Monday through Thursday, starting this month. And what a Lunch and Learn is the ability for you to get on during a lunchtime, 12 to 1 each day, Monday through Thursday, and have decisions experts on the line to be able to ask questions to your decision experts. Decision experts can range from people in sales to people in PS, our professional services, the people in QA, and customer success. So all different types of people get on there from decisions and allow you to ask any type of question you might have. And then we'll get you through Zoom, and we can, of course, we can answer a question there. We'll get back to you later. The next thing we have coming up here in the month of May is our professional certification. With Inside Decision, we provide all certifications and training for free. So this allows you to get certified in decisions professional that you can put on your resume, But the only thing with professional, you got to be an associate one also. And with everything here at Decisions, you want to make sure you are mindful of the time zone it's in, because both of these are in Eastern time zones, but we do offer classes in the British summertime and of course in Australia, because we are an international company with a wide base of customers. So for the rest of the month of May, we do have another webinar coming up here in 2 weeks, a webinar on applying machine learning models and decisions. It's a very cool and interesting webinar we have coming up to walk you through how we implement machine learning models and decisions with a couple of examples. So if you're not used to machine learning and want to learn more about machine learning, you can do that very quickly, easy. And just so you know, yes, Joe, there is a typo in our Q&A question. It is Help Monday. We provide you help also. It's not just held, it's help. We provide you both help and it's held Monday through Thursday. Good
Thank
catch.
you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. And then also right here, we have our beginner and intermediate training starting here in late May. Now, as you will notice, beginner training is somebody who's not really, there's a product. This simply takes the full 5 designers to be able to help you build the product from scratch. Intermediate is more people, customer look pro. If you're a new customer, beginning is where you start at. And then, of course, if you want a refresher course, you're more than welcome to take a refresher course because things change over time with the product. And as you notice, this is in British summertime. So if y'all are early birds and want to get up for the British time, you're more than welcome to do that also. So the next slide I want to talk to you about, and I'm going to turn it back over to my lovely colleague Jessica to go over the agenda for today.
Yeah, so we'll just briefly run through the agenda before we dive right into the product. So first, Tyler is going to be walking us through a demonstration, the front end of a demonstration of a built-out dynamic questionnaire process for a loan application. Then after we kind of demo a few of those dynamic questionnaire paths, we're going to dive into the back end of that process and break down the different areas used to accomplish that build. Now, after we kind of reverse engineer that existing build pattern and break down those individual areas, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that existing built process, I'm going to make a copy of it, and we're going to build a brand new rule chain from scratch that we're going to use to create a patient intake questionnaire. And then finally, with any remaining time that we have, we'll be covering any questions that you might have. And speaking of questions, or speaking of Q&A, go ahead and take a moment to look at your Zoom panel. It should look just like the picture on the slide. So throughout the webinar, you'll be able to chat with Decisions team members utilizing the chat feature on the very left-hand side. Or if you utilize the raise your hand function, someone on our team will reach out to you during the webinar and get that question answered. And of course, you can always use the Q&A feature for questions as well. And I also want to encourage everyone to use these features throughout the webinar as questions come up. Don't feel like you have to save them for the end, as some of your questions might actually guide our conversation today. Now with that, I am going to hand it back over to Tyler, and he's going to walk us through the loan application questionnaire.
Great. So just give me a second to switch my screens. Okay, can everyone see my screen? It should be a Decision Studio at the top.
I can.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So if you are familiar with this product, I'm actually showing this product in version 7, our new release product, just released over the past couple months. So this screen might look a little different to you who are used to seeing Decisions, maybe in version 5, version 6. This is our version 7 product. So you can see here we have different applications installed, but first of all, I'm just going to dive in to the process and show you how it works. So I'm going to simply click Start Workflow, and I'm going to run my loan questionnaire. So when I run my loan questionnaire, you'll see right here, our screen pops up to the left. So I'm going to simply type in my name and collect some information from my name. Please ignore my autofill from Google. I love Google. I'll put 25. That's how I feel like today. I feel like I'm 25 today. Type in my email address. I'm going to determine what type of loan today I'm going to take. I'm going to do a personal loan today. So I already have a mortgage. I don't want another mortgage. And I'm going to say my monthly income is, I don't know, $5,000 a month. So I'm going to click Submit on this. It's going to bring down a path of what type of personal loan I want to do today. So I will go ahead and type in car, because I want a car loan. I need a new car. I want a new car badly.
Me too.
Even though I don't drive very far much anymore for work, I still want a new car. So then it brings me what year the car it is. So first of all, I think I want an antique car. So I don't drive very much. I want an antique car. Of course, an antique car is anything over 10. So I'm just going to say I want a 2001. That's antique enough for me. And hit submit, and that's going to bring me to a new question. All right, are you looking for an antique loan type car? Of course I am, because I need to be able to have a loan for this. I click check, and now I bring the loan amount. So very quick and easy to see how different questions pop up based on my answers. I hit submit. Now you saw one flow. So now I'm taking on a different path with the same loan questionnaire. I'm gonna kick this off again. Type in my name again, so I'm gonna collect the information again. Please bear with me as I type this in. And with this, you can email the person. You can have this auto-populate if they're logged in the system and only answer them the questions they need. Oh, Ronald, I'm sorry. My car is that old too. But technically, a car over 10 years old is technically an antique. You can classify as an antique. So now I'm going to simply add in my monthly outcome. I'm going to submit. So this time, I'm going to do a car loan again. But this time, I'm going to get a nice big pay raise. So I'm going to go for a newer model. I can't still afford a brand new car, but I can go to a new model in 2020. So now in 2020, it asks me different questions. Because it's a new car, it's not an antique car type of loan. So I'm going to add, what does it make? I'm going to pick a Tesla today. And I don't know what a good Tesla is, so I'm just going to type in, I don't know, this is a T model. Do I want gap coverage? Yes, because if I wreck my Tesla or if it's auto driving and wrecks itself, I want to make sure that I have gap coverage that will cover my loan. So once I hit submit, it follows me down to a new path. What is the gap insurance amount? What insurance? I want to cover the full amount. So my car's $50,000 this year. It's a cheap Tesla, but it is. And now I'll complete the process. So you can see, based on the answers I provided earlier, I'm able to go down 2 different paths without having to go to different forms, different flows, just based on our rule chain. So that's 2 quick and easy questions. So yes, Glenn, you can do have a drop-down model. Oh yes, a good 3, S, and X. You can see I'm not a Tesla fan. I can't afford Teslas, so I just put Teslas because it's a popular brand right now. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica so she can talk about how we actually did this from a data structure perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I dive in there, I want to go ahead and answer this question. Is every page a new form? I'm really glad that you asked that right up front. The question to that is, or the answer to that is no. We're actually utilizing the same exact form. And that's one of the really great features of this design approach is you can design one form that will display all of these different questions. And when we jump into the back end and get to that form portion, you'll see we're using something called a mixed type repeater, which allows for this type of behavior. So great question. I'm really glad that you asked that right up front. All right, so we're going to dive in here, take a look at some of the things that we've put together to actually make this loan application or this dynamic questionnaire working. But one thing that I want to mention right from the get-go here is depending on your use case, you might not need to go through each and every step that we're covering today. So keep in mind the question types that you need, where you want those questions to live, and if you're going to use our UI or not is going to drive the required steps in this approach. But the first thing that you want to do when you're building anything in decisions, not only a dynamic questionnaire project, but any project, is you want to think about your data types, those data types that will be needed, and go ahead and get those built. And today we're actually using 2 different data types, but we'll have 4 different structures or 4 different structures that we'll be covering, but they're just 2 different types. Now, the first type that we used is an entity for our questions. And just as a refresher for anyone who's not aware of what an entity structure in decisions is, really why we're using this is going to allow the questions that are getting stored to this entity to live in the decisions portal in a folder that we created. And because it lives in that decisions portal, we're going to be able to take direct actions such as editing or deleting any of those questions right from the portal without having to build any custom flows to manage those existing questions. Now, if we look at this data structure that we have defined here, we have a unique ID, which is going to be very important throughout the process because we will be referencing this unique ID to actually fetch the appropriate questions to display. We're going to have the type. So which type of question are you asking? Is it going to be a text question, a decimal question, or maybe a Boolean type question where you need a checkbox? The question field that you see, that's where we're going to be storing the actual question that will be presented to that end user. And then we also have what's called a data pair. So for those of you who are not familiar with data pairs, this is going to allow you to search by a particular property for a complex object. So you can use, in the case that we'll be using, we'll be pairing that unique ID with our data pair. And based on that unique ID, we'll be able to pull in an object. And we'll take a look at what those different objects are going to look like when we look at the next structures that we build. So again, a data pair just allows you to search by a specific property and return a complex object or a complex data type. So we'll go ahead and close out of here. And
now, Jessica, we do have 2 questions that are already in the chat, so I just want to go and answer them quickly if you don't mind. So the 2 questions are, is this a backend relational database? Yes, we use a SQL database to store our logic, but if you want to store these questions or question banks or pull them from a different data type database, you can definitely do that. And can the questions be edited using a custom UI? It can be edited, and we'll show you how. It can be a custom UI or a different type of flow. It calls an API or through actual decisions. Here, she'll show you here in a second. Sorry, Jessica, go ahead.
Yep, no problem here. So I mentioned before that using that data pair, we can use some property to pull in this structure. So the way that we'll be using these next structures here, these are flow structures. We'll actually be storing them as data pairs, and you'll see that in the back end in just a moment here. But we created 3 different flow structures. And for those of you who aren't familiar with flow structures, those are structures that don't create a table in the database. Really, they're just used, as the name implies, to structure your data. So it's going to help have unformatted data be used in a formatted way throughout your flow and throughout your processes. So this is how we're going to be displaying them on our form in a minute, and you'll kind of see how all this ties together. But we have our checkbox flow structure, where again, we're going to be storing the question, the type of question, that unique ID. But what's different here is the answer. So the answer for a checkbox type question is going to be a Boolean, because we're going to be displaying a checkbox, and the data type that's associated with the checkbox is a Boolean value. Now, just to move on a little bit, we also have a number question flow structure, where again, we're capturing question type and unique ID. But for the answer here, when we're displaying this component on the form, because it's a number question and we're going to be displaying a number box, the answer that comes out of that number box is going to be a decimal. And then same thing for text question. When you're displaying this on the form, or this object on the form, you're going to have a text box that allows them to type in some free text, or maybe it's a drop down. But regardless, the type of data that comes out of those components is going to be a string value. So our answer here is a string. And now that we know what all those structures look like, or we have those structures built, let's take a look at our question bank. We've already populated it, and we'll show you how to populate that in just a moment. But what Tyler is showing is we have this folder where we've stored off our different questions. And as I mentioned before, because this lives in the portal, he's able to just right click on this item, say edit. He didn't have to build any flow to do that. It's just available right out of the box. And now we can make any changes to this question should we need to maintain these questions over time. So let's take a look at the flow that we built to actually populate these questions. And I also want to make it clear here that this might be a step that you skip in your process if you already have a database that has your questions, or maybe you have a spreadsheet that these questions can easily be loaded into decisions with. So again, this step might be skipped in your use case, but we just wanted to show you how we went about building a flow to handle populating the different questions to our question bank. So on my flow here, the first step that we have is this get next number step. So the reason that we have this here is every time this step is hit, it's going to grab the next number the next number. So the first time it runs, it's going to grab number 1. The next time it runs, it's going to grab number 2. But the reason we have this is so that when we're generating those unique IDs to store with our question, we want to make sure we have a different ID every time. So that's going to cut down on that manual input error where someone might put in a unique ID that already exists. Now, after that, we have a form, which we'll see in just a moment when we debug this process. But this form, we're just using to capture those question details. So what's the question type? What is the actual question? So on and so forth. Based on the question type that they select in the form, we're going to use that type and we're going to pass it into the string match step to determine which create data step we want to use to actually format the data coming from that form. So again, based on the different question type, if you remember, there's going to be different flow structures associated with that question type. And again, it's just really the answer part that's different. But again, because that's different data, we need to store it in a different way. And then finally, excuse me, I need a little bit of water here. Finally, we have the step that's just storing off this data to the database and adding it to our question bank. And if we pop open the inputs here, I kind of just want to drive home this data pair that I've been talking about. So if we scroll down on the right-hand side a little bit to where we see pair, what we're doing here is we're mapping the unique ID right into the name for the data pair, because those are the two fields that are a part of a data pair. So it's going to be name. And then the other part is the output value. So when you search a data pair and you're searching by this unique ID, what object do you want to return? And that's where we're going to be returning those specific flow structures so that we can display those on forms in a specific way. But just keep this data pair thing in mind, because we'll revisit it a couple times throughout the back end. We'll go ahead, we'll close out of here. We'll debug this just to show it running in action. When we hit start debug, you can see we already have our unique ID populated. So we have Q34. We'll go ahead and pick a question type, maybe a checkbox question. Maybe the question is, are you enjoying this webinar? Or are you tired of hearing Jessica speak? Either one of those is okay. But really, we just want to show you this running. And then we can give our question a name. And then when Tyler hits OK, we can see based on the type being a checkbox question, we're going to travel down that checkbox question path. We're using our create data step to format the data, and then we're storing it off to that question bank. All right, so now that we've covered the different data types and how we populate this question bank, I'm going to hand it back over to Tyler, and he's going to walk through the rest of the back end here.
Thank you, Jessica, very much. So the first thing I'm going to cover is the form that she described earlier, how we input the questions into the form. So in our questionnaire form, this brings our form designer up. If you're not familiar with 7, this is our new form designer layout in 7. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have our components, and I'm using a mixed type repeater control as my component here. So you simply search for it here. Click a type today. There's my mixed type repeater, and drag and drop over there. But on my mixed type repeater control, I have different sources. If you notice, these different sources on the right-hand side are checkbox, number, and text. So just like the questions we had earlier, there are different user controls, which the user control allows you how you can present that type of data on this data repeater. So if I simply click on checkbox, I can edit the source, and it brings me to another form designer, which is a simple form designer, which just has the question and the answer. So as you saw earlier, this is how my checkbox is displayed in the question. Now the question actually comes from the data that she said earlier, that output our data pair we had earlier, and actually we picked just the question. And of course the checkbox is just the answer part of that equation. So you can see here's our checkbox. I can go and check my number layout also. So I can show you that I have the same type of setup for my data question. Of course, this is the number box where I can input the data answer. And then for my last piece, my string, you can make these editable where you'd have different things. So my string type or my text type value, I have my question on one row and I have a second row, which is actually my answer. So just as you described earlier, you can have drop-down lists in here for answers, just as Glenn answered earlier. So you have a lot of different options here to be able to access what type of data control you have over the questions, where I can get it from a list, get it from a different type of source in the flow, but you can have different types of questionnaires also.
And just to be clear here, this is one of the reasons why we use those 3 different flow structures, so that each one of those different sources could be using the appropriate data type for the answer. So again, just as a reminder, checkbox is going to be the Boolean, the text box is going to be the string, and the number box is going to be that decimal value.
Yes. So now you see now it's a very simple form to create. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Then I'm going to go back into actually how the flow worked. So let me just open my run questionnaire flow and edit it. So as you can see, this is my flow form setup. So first thing I'm going to do is pass in my rule chain, which I'll go over a little more about my rule chain here in a little bit. Then I have my missing inputs. My missing inputs is the flow, which says, okay, I've got this information from the rule chain. Now I need to figure out what is missing. So this flow does that. And very simply, what this flow does is for each instant input, which all the rule chains pass out. If you don't get to the should continue step, which I'll show you later, is passing out what inputs I need to complete the rule chain. So for 4 missing inputs, I then run a truth table. This truth table is where you create the link between the missing input and that default value of the data pair, which is the question ID, which for the is this a good webinar is question 34, but for all other questions it could be different question types. This is our truth table designer, if you're not familiar with it. And then of course, after that, we do a fetch step where we fetch the actual question and then add that question to a list. That list is what we pass into the form as a question set to say, okay, display all these questions, as you saw earlier, such as the antique car, the make and model of the car earlier. The next step we do is a rule we have built in, is list empty. Because of course, once the list is empty, that means all the questions for the questionnaire has been answered. You want to end the flow and save the data, of course, off. But then we have our questionnaire form, which I showed you earlier, which has our mixed type repeater on there, which displays the questions. And then we go into a list mapping step. Now with the list mapping step, of course, coming out of the questionnaire and the mixed type data repeater, can talk today, is a list of objects of the question set. Well, I need a list of data pairs because that's how I'm evaluating my stuff. It's in a data pair. So I change it to a data pair, and then I add those items to the list. And what that list is actually my questions. So every time I work through this flow, complete the workflow, I keep adding every answered item, every answered question to my list. This creates a list which I then pass into my rule chain of all the questions which have been answered. So now I'm going to go into my rule chain. So this is my rule chain that you saw earlier as I walk you through the process. And this is a different type designer. On the left-hand side, you see different type of inputs of rules, input data, business knowledge. And Jessica here a little later show you how to build one from scratch here a little later, so I'm not going through that, but I want to show you how we actually arrived at this. So this is my first input step where I have data I need. So I have my name and a string, age, email address, type of loan, and household income. And of course, then I pass it to a rule which says, is this a mortgage application or not? Of course, it is not. So we go down this path. So then I do my type of personal loan was the next question I asked. Just give me 1 second.
And while he's coughing, I want to point out a couple of things about these inputs that he's showing. So on the very first step where it says name, age, email address, type of loan, household income, the way that we're utilizing this rule chain is one of the features with rule chains is as soon as it runs, it has the ability to output a list of inputs that's missing. So what inputs are missing that we need to move on in our rule chain? And that list of missing inputs is what we're running through the rule table that he showed you earlier to grab the appropriate question to display on the form. So that way we know as soon as, or every time this rule chain runs, any inputs that are missing, we need to ask that question so we can get the answer, run the rule chain again, and continue it to have it go down the necessary path.
Thank you, Jessica. Sorry about that. And then of course you see the year of the car, and then of course if the year of the car is over 2010, it's not an antique. And then of course he goes down the antique path if it's an antique car, and of course in the make and model. So as you can see right here, you complete different input paths and different rules to evaluate the answers to those questions, and provide different questions after the rule has been evaluated. And then we get to our should continue step. And should continue is just a simple rule which you want to end it. So like this is just an empty rule. It says just true, because we know that once we get to that point, we've answered every question in the rule chain we need answered. So we're good to go with all the inputs to the rule chain. So that's simply how we do our rule chain in Simple Designer. And now, just like Jessica said, you see we have a special type of output, not supplied inputs. So this is a special type output that comes from rule chains that we pass into our missing inputs. So the last thing I want to describe before I turn it back over to Jessica to build one from scratch is we have a list of items coming here. And of course, this list is a data pair. But of course, the rule chain is looking for string, number, decimal, Boolean type data. So we need to go there and convert that from a data pair to an actual input the rule chain can handle. So there we do converter flows. So with all of these converter flows, we take information. This is actually not going to do that one because the string. I'm going to do my number one, the decimal one. So within this, we pass in each missing input that has a pair unique ID, and then we get the property of that object. So we call for a unique ID. We say, is this unique ID for conversion? And then we get the property in the object again. So the first time we get the unique ID and compare it, and then we get the output value. Okay, yes, we got the correct one, and then we create the data. So then we convert that string, which all objects are strings, to a decimal, which is then passed into the rule engine, the rule chain, to be able to say, okay, yes, this is an age, it is a decimal, it is the input I needed. So
and really, oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and really just, again, to make the converter flow really clear, because especially for those of you who might not be familiar with converter flows, it allows you to take in data, build a flow that's going to allow you to output a different type of data. And that converter flow that he just showed you, again, just to make it very clear, is it's just taking in the list of answered questions from the form, which, as we know, is output as a list of objects. And we can't pass in that list of objects to the rule chain. So inside of those converter flows, we're looping through all of the objects, so those answered questions, to find the unique ID that matches for the specific conversion that we're looking for. And then once we find that match, we're going to pull out that single value from that object that we can then pass into the rule chain.
Thank you, Jessica. And there is a question of how this is different from a rule set.
Yeah, great question. So rule sets and rule chains, they're different in the way that rule sets, you don't really string together series of different rules. You don't map them together. That's one of the differences. That rule sets also don't output missing inputs. So if you're trying to run a rule set and there's some inputs that are missing, one of the outputs or you're not going to get an output of those missing inputs. There's quite a few differences between them. Rule sets you can just think of as a group of rules with order and dependency. You don't have to string them together in a flow. Every time that rule set's called, they're all going to run. It's not going to take different paths unless you're using conditional rule sets. But what we can do is we can send you up some follow-up documentation on rule chains and rule sets, because they are very different concepts. And Tyler, if you have anything to add there, go ahead.
Nope, I'm good. You did a great job explaining it, Jessica.
All right.
So,
go ahead.
Sorry. So, if there's any more questions before we move on to letting Jessica build one from scratch, as I switch my screen to Jessica and let her share now.
Oh, let me share the right screen here. And Tyler, can you see that Decision Studio across the top?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, great. So what we're going to do is we are going to actually take a copy of this run loan questionnaire here. Just again, I'll pop it open just so you can see it. It's the flow that Tyler was just running through. I'm going to make a copy of this. We're going to get rid of the loan rule chain here. We're going to build a rule chain from scratch. And you'll see that after I build that rule chain from scratch, we can still use the same structure. We can still use the same form. We can still use this missing inputs from run chain subflow here. We can still use all of this. We just have to place in a new rule chain. And then we have a completely different questionnaire. So again, by using this kind of pattern, you can use the same form, you can use the same structure, and create many types of questionnaires. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to right click on this run loan action. So for anyone who doesn't know, you can copy anything in Decisions. You can copy rules, you can copy flows, reports, dashboards, whatever the case may be, and you can make slight changes or tweaks to them so that you can have a completely different version of it. So again, it's just a great way to jumpstart your build if you know that it's going to be a very similar process. But we are going to call this our patient intake questionnaire. So I'll hit create. And you'll see it is the exact copy of the flow that Tyler just walked through. Now, I did mention before that you can use the same missing inputs from rule chain subflow. I'm actually going to replace it here. The reason being, let me just jump in here and kind of explain why. The reason being is the truth table that's currently existing within this subflow only houses the questions specific to the loan application. So again, if we have missing inputs, we're using this truth table to read the inputs from the rule chain that are missing, and then output the specific question that we need to display based on that missing input. So because none of my patient intake questions are included on this truth table, we're just going to swap it out for a new subflow. But just know if you have multiple questionnaires, you can have one single truth table that houses all of those questions, and then those output question value, or I'm sorry, that houses all those missing inputs and then outputs those question values. Again, just to keep it kind of separate, we're going to go ahead and swap it out. I'll show you the truth table that I have built. It's exactly the same, but I'll go ahead, I'll delete this. I'm going to go grab my run subflow step here. I've actually already took a copy of the missing inputs and made changes with the truth table just for time purposes today. But I'll go ahead and pick my missing inputs patient intake subflow. And then just to show you, it is exactly the same subflow. I'll open it up here. You can see it's the same exact steps. The only thing that's different here is just this truth table. So this particular truth table is only going to worry about the questions that are going to be a part of the patient intake questionnaire. All right, great. So now that we have that done, let's go ahead and let's build our rule chain. Just going to go ahead and remap this here. All right, so we're going to delete the existing rule chain. We are going to find our run rule chain step so we can build one from scratch. So again, I'm going to drag it over here. I need to map this step here because we want to pass out, or we want to pass in all of those answered questions that we have to our rule chain. So I'm just going to move that over here. And I am going to create a new one. So we're going to call this our patient intake questionnaire. We'll go ahead and leave those spelling errors. I'm a terrible speller, but that's okay. And here we can see this is the rule chain designer, but I'm starting from a completely blank slate. So we're only going to touch on a few of these different rule chain or steps today. In fact, I'm only going to touch on 2 of them. But just know, rule chains are not only used for dynamic questionnaires. They're not only used for the purpose of spitting out what inputs are missing for that rule chain to continue running. You can use rule chains to perform calculations that you might want to output. You can use rule chains for a number of different things, but today we're really just going to focus on the ability to use those missing inputs elsewhere in our flow. So speaking of missing inputs, the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to grab my input data step, and I'm just going to drag and drop it in here. And again, just to make it very clear, what's happening is any of the inputs that I define, because this is the very first step that's going to run, when this rule chain runs, if it determines that we don't have inputs available for that, meaning that it hasn't been answered, that question hasn't been answered yet, then we're going to spit out those as missing inputs, and then we're going to display the appropriate questions. So the first questions that I want to ask to my patients as they're coming in, we'll pretend that it's my medical practice maybe, pipe dreams, is their name, their age, which is going to be a decimal, and then we also want to just check to see if they're insured or not. So I'm actually, let's see, this is insurance, and this is going to be a Boolean. So we know we're going to display a checkbox question. All right. So now that I have those inputs defined, what I can do is I can actually start creating rules to determine, based on the inputs that are provided once they do answer those questions, where I want my rule chain to go next. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to find my true and false rule. So we'll be building simple statement rules. And I'm going to connect my input to this rule. And one of the things that you should know about rule chains is when you connect an input to this particular step where you can build a rule, when I go in to start building that rule, any input steps that are connected to it, I'm automatically going to have access to that data when I'm building my rule. So I don't have to actually define these as inputs to my rule. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a rule that checks to see if they are insured. So if they are insured, I might want to ask who their insurance provider is. If they're not insured, then there's no point in asking them who their insurance provider is because we already know they're not insured. So I'm just going to rename this just so it's a little bit clear what's happening in here. So we'll say this is our is patient insured. There we go. So on the true path, again, if they are insured, and there I go again with some great spelling errors. If they are insured, we want to ask them who their insurance provider is. So again, I'm going to associate some input data so that when this rule chain runs and it runs down this true path here, I know that I need to go grab that question, or decisions knows it needs to go grab that question and display it on the form when it renders next. So I'm going to say, well, we'll go ahead and define the input data. This is going to be our insurance provider name, which is going to be a text value. We'll let them type that in. And then on the false path, we don't need to ask that insurance provider name. Maybe what we want to ask them is we want to ask them if they have a fever. So again, I'm going to grab input data so that when it travels down this path, we're going to know we haven't provided this input data yet. So I know that I need to ask that question on the form. So this is going to be fever, and this is actually going to be a Boolean value. So we just want to display a checkbox to them. All right, great. Now I do have a couple of other questions that I'm going to add in here later. But what I'd like to do is, as I start adding these different questions, I want to go back into the process, do a little bit of mapping and debug it, just so you can see exactly how this is running. So I'm going to go ahead and click save here. I will close out. And here you can see that we need to configure some of those inputs. And here is where these converter flows come into play again. So again, just as a refresher, the first time this rule chain runs, it's going to know that it's missing age, name, and if they're insured or not. So it's going to grab all of those questions that need to be asked, and it's going to display it on the form. So that's actually going to be the first form that you see. And then once they answer those questions, we're going to run it through here. We're going to perform some converters on it to pass those answers into our rule chain to determine the next inputs that are missing. So here I'll go ahead and start configuring some of these converters. So I'm just going to pick run converter, and I'm going to pick, for the first one, I'm going to pick our decimal converter flow. And again, this is just a flow that Tyler showed you earlier. One thing I want to mention here as I am filling this out is I know that we're covering a lot of advanced things and not going into all of the details on how everything is mapped or set up. So if you're interested in seeing this project, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll provide you guys a project that you can import into your own environment and start playing with it. But again, what I'm doing is I'm passing in this new list, which is coming from this step, which is the list of answered questions. And then I need to tell it, okay, which unique ID are we looking for here so we can pass out the appropriate answer. And for age, on my other screen, I can see this is associated with Q27. Now, as I'm filling, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm going to let Jessica take a break actually to fill this in. So I just want to go ahead and recover any questions you might have had earlier, or any new questions. I'm just going to say, so for these forms, yes, you can have drop downs. So that is possible that you can have drop downs when you go and edit your source, you create a drop down source for your questions. Absolutely. Is every page a new form? No, it is not. As you see, there's only one form on this flow. It's just passing the list of questions to be asked on that specific form. Is it back in a relational database? Absolutely. Our logic right here is stored in a relational database. You can choose to store the data, like the questions in decisions, or you can store it in an external database. So like a MySQL, a different type of system completely, you can definitely do that. We can integrate through those either by calling a query, a table, a store procedure, or through an API if they have an open API. Can questions be edited using a custom UI? Absolutely. Or like we showed you earlier, you can go into portal view or the designer view and be able to simply right click and edit those questions also via a report of that folder that can be absolutely exposed through an API or as a custom UI. And now how is this different from a rule set? Yes, this is different from a rule set because a rule set usually passing in data and you're having one output and like a score built sometimes for that. With a rule chain, it can actually call back out and tell you what inputs are missing. With a rule set, it takes whatever input you did and does the rule set. With a rule chain, it tells you, okay, you're missing these inputs and collects the data continuously until the actual rule chain is complete. And that's really the big difference between a rule set and rule chains. Now we do have documentations on our website about that. If there's any more questions you might have asked, feel free to reach out to us about that. So now Jessica has completed that. I'm gonna turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Tyler. All right, so now that we have this all mapped, let's go ahead and debug this and let's see how this is going to function. So when I run it, before I fill out this form, I want to point out the outputs that are coming from this rule chain. It's the first time we're running it. If you remember, I'm going to just pop in this debug view here. The first 3 inputs we were expecting were name, age, insurance. Obviously, we haven't had the ability to pass those into our rule chain yet. So our rule chain is going to stop and say, hey, we're not going to execute anymore. And we're going to pass out that that name, age, and insurance were not provided. So again, if I jump back into this debug view and I look at the output from this rule chain, you can see there's 3 items that we haven't provided. And if I open this up, again, you can see this is name. If I scroll down a little bit, age, and then if I scroll down a little bit further, this is insurance. So because those 3 inputs were not provided, if I look at the inputs and outputs here, we're passing in those list of not supplied inputs, and then using that truth table and the other logic within our flow, the output from this missing inputs flow here is going to actually be those specific questions that we need to display on the form. So the patient's full name, the patient's age, and do you have insurance? So if I open up, if I close this and I go back to my form, again, you can see we passed those right into our mixed type repeater so that we can display those 3 individual questions. So patient full name, I'll go ahead and type that in. I'll be 30. The first time I fill this out, yeah, let's say I do have insurance. I hit submit. And now it's going to travel down the path where we're looking for that insurance provider name. So again, if I look at, you can see it's completed the loop here. It's gone back into our rule chain. And if I look at execution 2 of the inputs and outputs for our rule chain, maybe actually I'll just look at our output here. You can see this time there's only 1 input that's required that we haven't provided, and that's going to be our insurance provider name. So again, that missing inputs flow has ran. It's went and fetched the appropriate questions that we should display into our form. And as you can see, it's asking me who my insurance provider is. So I can just type in insurance provider name, I'll hit submit. And then because there's no longer any questions to ask, we're going to save that data off and our process is going to end. Now, again, I'll go ahead and run this one more time. We'll go down the other path. So I'll put my name in. You know what, Tyler, I'm feeling like you today. Maybe I'll be 25. And this time I'll say I don't have insurance. So this time when I click submit, you're going to see I'm actually being displayed a different question. Do you have a fever? I can hit yes. And again, we have no more missing inputs. So our process is going to end. So let's go ahead and add a little bit more complexity here. We'll go back out, we'll debug it, and then we'll jump into any final remaining questions. So I'll go back into edit rule chain. And let's see here. Maybe what I want to ask is if they have a fever, then maybe I want to check what their temperature is. So before I can check what their temperature is, I need another rule that's going to determine, or that's going to examine the actual answer that was provided for if they have a fever or not. So again, I'm just going to drag this true false rule over into my rule chain. I'll go into my edit patient intake question rule. I'll go ahead and build that. You can see that because we have fever added as an input to our flow now, I can actually, or our rule chain, I can actually build a condition around that. So we'll say if fever is true, then we want to ask what their temperature is. All right, so I'm just going to again rename my step. Does patient have fever? And on that true path, we want to ask, okay, what's your temperature? So I'm just going to go back. I'll grab my input data so that when it hits this step, when we get to it in the rule chain, it can let us know that this input's missing so that we can serve up that question. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I did put it on the right path. Awesome. All right, so I'm just going to go and add in temperature. And this, we want to provide a decimal or a Boolean, or I'm sorry, a decimal or a number value to them. So I'm going to pick that as our type. I'll hit close. And then on the false path, maybe we want to ask if they don't have a fever, maybe we'll just jump straight into asking them if they have a cough. So again, I'm going to go grab my input data step, drag it over here. We'll connect our false path to it. And I'll type in cough. As you can see, I really cannot spell today or ever. And this one, we want to display a checkbox. So it's type of Boolean. All right. So again, for time purposes, maybe this is where we will leave it at today. So I'll go ahead and save this. I will update some of those inputs, and then we'll run it in our debugger. So again, I'm just going to simply map in those answered questions. We're going to use our converters.
So now as she's doing this, she only's got one left. I'll just let you go, Jessica.
Thank you, sir. And again, just as a reminder, this is being recorded. So if you need to come back and review this at any time, it will be on our website in a couple of days. And as well, if you want to drill in to this project and actually see how everything is configured, we'd be happy to provide a copy of this for you so you can import it into your own environment and really pick apart all the different pieces and see how it's really put together. So again, this is our last one here. This is checkbox because we're dealing with a Boolean value. And this is associated with Q25. All right, so now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and debug this again. I'm going to get these questions. We'll go down the path where I don't have insurance. It's going to ask me if I have a fever. We'll go ahead and say I do this time. And now we can see it's asking me, okay, what is your temperature? So I can provide a temperature. Oh, that's a little high.
Oh.
Definitely want to go to the doctor for that. I'll hit submit. And then it has ended. So I'll just run it one more time just to show you the coughing path. Maybe this time I'll be 50. We'll say I don't have a fever, so we'll leave that alone. And then now it's going to ask me, do you have a cough? So as you can see, using this pattern, you can create a number of different questionnaires. So once you've set up this template once, really what it comes down to is maintaining that question bank, building the different rule chains for each of the questionnaires, and then also just maintaining that truth table that allows you to fetch the specific question based on the unique ID. So it does seem like a little bit of setup on the front end to get this template, or not, I won't say template, but this kind of pattern down in our main flow. But once you have it built once, once you have those converter flows built once, you can reuse those across multiple questionnaires. And again, just as a reminder, this isn't the only way that you can approach building dynamic questionnaires. You might have a single form that has all of your questions on it, and then you're using visibility rules to show or hide certain questions. Or you might have a bunch of different forms chained together in a flow, and using rules in the flow, you might route it to the specific form that you want to display. So again, there's all kinds of different ways to approach it. We also have a great webinar on building dynamic questionnaires using simple flows. That is on our website if you want to check that out. If the visibility rule option sounds interesting, we have webinars available for showing you how to set up visibility rules and setting up those advanced forms. And again, if there's any question around kind of the design approach that you should take based on the questionnaire use case that you have, our team is happy to speak to you about that at any time. You can always reach out to support@decisions.com, or you can reach out to sales@decisions.com, and we'll get those questions answered for you. So the last remaining minutes here, I just want to check to see if we have any other questions.
And we do.
All right, so let's see here. This is more about the front end. Can the form be created in a way that presents the user a WhatsApp-like experience? I'm just going to read this in my head here. I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing me talk. Well, actually, read it out loud. I mean, by that one that looks like a chat where users are presented with one question at a time and where they can see the full dialogue if you scroll up. Yes, absolutely. So if you want to display the answer or the questions that have already been answered, there's just a little bit more logic that you would have to include here. So currently we're just passing in the empty list, but you might have another step in here that merges the two lists together. You might have a list of answered questions that you want to pass in along with a list of questions that haven't been answered. So you can absolutely have that experience.
Okay, and the next question, I'll take Jessica to give you a little breath.
Thank you, sir.
What happens when you click submit without entering? Does it just keep cycling back to the same question, acting like a required entry? The answer is it wouldn't go by submit and give you a validation error that's saying, hey, this answer is required to continue on the process. Now that's if you have it set up that way, you can do it that way. That's how we set up today. That if you don't answer a question, if it's a true false, of course, if it's not checked, it is completely on the path. But if it requires an answer like a number or a string question or a text question, it would just sit there and say, okay, red warning, validation, I need to validate that and answer that question.
Absolutely. Let's see here, another question. Can the form be saved and completed at a later time? Carol, absolutely. You would just have a different, I'll just go ahead and just add a button here, maybe a save button on your form. And what you can do is on that save, you might have some logic that stores it off to a table. So the next time that they run, maybe up front, you can check who the user is and you can bring in, or you can fetch those questions that they've already been answered and bring them back to the appropriate place in their questionnaire. So absolutely, just building in that logic.
Great. And when Decisions automatically adds a rule you created to say your forms directory, would you recommend moving it to your rules directory or leave it where Decisions placed it? That's all dependent on how you structure it. We'd recommend moving it to your rules group, but for the demo purposes, for this webinar demo purpose, so we didn't move it, but we recommend placing it where, and you can create substructure. So you can like, okay, that's questionnaire, and I want my forms and have my form rules as a separate folder underneath there, have my flow rules underneath there. What I like to do is say, okay, this is my form, these are my main flows, and then have like a subflow folders below that, so I can break it out that way so I know where everything is placed. But that's really up to you because that's a free form folder structure you can build, but it's best practice to put it in subfolders and folders. Anything you want to add, Jessica, to that?
Nope, great answer, great question. All right, so with that, I think really the final thing is, I'll go ahead and drag it over here. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, feel free to reach out to us at sales@decisions.com or support@decisions.com, and we'd be happy to answer any of those questions for you, as well as provide you with a copy of this project if you need it. Feel free to check back on our website for a recording of this webinar if you want to go back and review anything. And then also I'll mention, feel free to check out our documentation on our website. It has a lot of really great information about some of the specific features that we use today. So if you want to learn more about mixed repeaters, check it out. If you want to learn more about the other capabilities that rule chains offer, please check out our documentation. It'll provide you with a lot of really great information. All right, with that, we are signing off from the headquarters here in Chesapeake. Well, at least I am, and Tyler, you're signing off from your home in Tennessee. And with that, Tyler, any last closing remarks?
Nope, I don't see any more questions. If you have, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or through our sales or support channel to be able to have any more questions you might have.
All right, thanks everyone.